So then we fast forward, and the book of Exodus tells us, and many say that the Exodus is sort of where the story really starts. That Genesis is a preamble or a prologue, if you will, for the Hebrew people. But it's really in Exodus that the Hebrew people take shape and they take form because of our story for today. So Exodus starts, and it informs us that generations pass, and a new Pharaoh ascends to the throne, and this Pharaoh does not know Joseph or his family. And instead, this new Pharaoh looks out at this group of foreigners, they still were foreigners at the time, and sees them as a threat because they are growing in number. And he seeks to enslave them. Now, this is a lot different than the slavery that we're used to thinking about in the history of our country. This was simply they sort of fell out of favor with those who were in power. Those who are in power, when they look down and they see a threat to their power, oftentimes persecution begins to take place. This is not a unique story by any means in history. And so the Hebrew people were forced into this labor, hard labor, to build. And they cry out to God. And again, these are God's people that have found themselves in a foreign place. For a good reason, they were saved because of this foreign place. But now it's not so much. That's one of the reasons why we had Kristen read Matthew, because Egypt, again, becomes a place of a haven for Jesus. As he escapes, Joseph takes Joseph, who is Jesus' earthly father, takes his family down to Egypt to retreat, to be saved. And eventually we know they come back out. But it's there in Egypt that the Hebrew people begin to cry out. And God hears that cry and intercedes on their behalf. So God calls a man named Moses, as I was talking about. And we know Moses and his brother Aaron. And they go and they interact with Pharaoh. And they demand that God's chosen people be let go. And the Pharaoh protests. And there's plagues and this fantastic story that you can read out in the first 13 or 14 chapters of Exodus. And finally, after the last plague that kills everything, all the firstborns, both children as well as livestock, except for the Hebrew people's firstborn. After this 10th plague, the Pharaoh relents and he decides to let the people go. And they make a hasty retreat. They leave. They pack things quickly. And this becomes the Passover story that they still tell to this day, a story that we know that is told and is celebrated yearly. And then our story picks up in Exodus 14, and here's what we find. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people, that's the Pharaoh, that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people. And they said, what have we done letting Israel leave our service? So he had his chariot made ready, and he took his army with him. And he took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. I'm going to skip to verse 10. They began to chase them down. It says, as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back. And there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. I want to add verse 15 here. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward." And then picking up at the end of the story, then Moses stretched out his hand. So they had gotten to this point. They had gotten to the sea that was there in front of them. So they have a barrier in front of them. They have an army coming behind them. They're struggling. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. And the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back over the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea turned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. May God add God's blessing to the reading and to the hearing, and to the understanding of God's holy word. Thanks be to God. Amen. So last week I might have said this to you. I want to remind you that Egypt, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim in Hebrew, and it actually means narrow place or narrow way. This is important for us because this is where the Hebrew people are leaving from. A narrow place, a narrow way. Confined, tight space. And so they retreat, they leave, and as the Israelites are fleeing, they are going into a place where the future is unknown and uncertain. And it terrifies them. The people look out and they see this water that is in front of them, and they see this army bearing down on them, and they don't know what to do. It makes them fearful. They want nothing more than to go back to life as it was before. Yeah, it may have been hard, but at least they knew what they were getting into. At least they knew what that place was. Maybe it's just my personality type, but when it comes to the uncertainty of the future, that causes me a little bit of anxiety. I don't know about you. Because there's something comforting about that which is known. Something that is understood. Something that's sort of like a tight place. A place of comfort. Maybe this is what we get from the very beginning of our lives. I remember when my children were very, very tiny and they were first born, and we would wrap them right in the swaddle cloth, and that would keep them all tight for them to be able to sleep. Their arms would be locked in. Maybe that was a reminder to them that they were in their mother's womb, of that comfort that they had. Maybe that's where we get this concept of wanting some certainty in our lives. We want safety. This is actually even for us as adults. I don't know if you've heard about this thing, but there's this new thing out now that are called weighted blankets. Have you seen these? You can literally buy a very nice plush blanket that weighs 25 pounds. That weighs 30 pounds. That weighs up to 50 pounds. And I guess the concept is, as you're laying down, you pull this blanket over you, it just sort of smothers you. And that's supposed to make you feel comforted. Maybe I'm a little claustrophobic. That doesn't sound fun to me. But I think what that's getting at for people is that they need that safety of the known, of that protection. Because that's which is new and different can be scary. Causes us to be fearful. That's what the Israelites were experiencing there in the wilderness as they were leaving Egypt. The unknown of what could possibly be. Maybe they were just pessimistic. Maybe they're like some of us and we always look at that glass that's half empty rather than half full. And we think to ourselves, well, here's the top 15 things that could go wrong in my life in the next day. Anybody fall into that trap sometimes? Something happens and we immediately go, here it comes again. Or we live with that feeling of like, when is the other shoe going to drop? I wanted to read you verse 15 because the Lord looks down upon the Israelites as they are experiencing this life and says to Moses, tell them to go forward. That God has brought them to this place and doesn't want them to turn back. That they have gone from this narrow place in Egypt to a place of abundance if they would only trust in the Lord. What God has planned for them. God has brought us to this place. And yet many want to go back. Let's go back to the way it once was. Oh, wasn't it so much better back in Egypt? Well, no, it really wasn't. You were enslaved. But that's what we knew. We felt safe there. Exodus 14:13, one of the verses where it talks about deliverance. The word there is Yeshua. Yeshua. This is what Moses promises the people. This is what the Lord is going to do. The Lord is going to deliver you, is going to see you through that which you face. And he uses this Hebrew word Yeshua. Does that sound familiar to you? It should. Sounds an awful lot like Jesus to me. Yeshua. Because see, like the Israelites, friends, I think many people are longing for a moment of deliverance. I mean, what would that look like for you? What would that look like for us? What would it take for God to take you to a new place? To rescue you from whatever narrowing is happening in your life at this moment. Where is God telling you to go forward? Where is God telling us as a church? Go forward. It may mean that we need to leave some old stuff behind us. It may mean that we need to leave our old selves behind us. To let go of that which is narrowing us, to that which holds us back from fully experiencing God's expansive love in a very real way. It may be simply the way in which we look out at the world. What we pay attention to. Or maybe the way in which we judge that person that we look at in the mirror each morning. The way in which we feel about ourselves. It may be the way in which we look upon our neighbor or the stranger on the street that we see. Or maybe the way in which we view God in our lives or in the world. Friends, there's a lot going on in this world, a lot that is difficult, a lot that's hard. A lot is being revealed to us. Maybe life hasn't always been what we thought it was. And we can choose to sort of wring our hands about this and to lose sleep at night, or to simply say, I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. I've said that a time or two. But that's not really going to work out for us, is it? Or we can look out at an opportunity that we have. That this time that we live in, this culture that we exist in, this society that is all around us, that we are a part of, is ripe for an opportunity to be demonstrated a love that some folks have never even seen before. To be offered an opportunity to move from a narrow place, that confined, that restricted, that enslaved, to potential for love and hope and grace. There was a lot going on in that moment in which the Israelites were rescued from the sea. They were rescued not only from the sea, but also from that army that was coming behind them. And if they had had their way, they would have moved backwards. But thankful for Moses and for God's faithfulness, yet again, friends, over and over and over again, we're going to hear that God's faithfulness to us is what gives us hope for the future. And that God rescued long ago and wants nothing more than to rescue this day.